Hello everyone, this is Jette Sandahl from Copenhagen, and as you can see, I'm not here. Hurricane Maria blew all my travel plans to the winds this fall, but CAMOC asked me to address you briefly across this distance anyway, and I will do so with a few statements or experiences with museum activism, starting with Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which was a brilliant short version of what was an obvious point of departure for my generation of intellectuals, and which interestingly re-emerged lately. This thesis has served as a moral point of departure, as a commitment to always use one's personal intellectual resources, as well as those of one's institutions, in an active service of changing the world for the better. For museum, this distinction between just interpreting and changing the world is, of course, an important one. Interpretation in and by itself is not enough. The first museum I was part of creating was the Women's Museum of Denmark, and it was by definition and in essence an activist and advocacy museum. And there are two very basic epistemological and museological principles which the embeddedness in feminist research traditions gave me, and which have remained fundamental in the work I've done since. The first is this, that knowledge as well as the knower are always both situated. Or, as it has been expressed in recent philosophy, thinking is never free, but is always fundamentally entangled with the social context and with the powers within a given society. The other principle or set of principles are those of the rights to self-representation, that given these power structures, given this entanglement and situated knowledge, any group, any disenfranchised group, needs to fight for the rights to interpret its own history and culture, needs to participate and be consulted on all relevant matters. This is a position where indigenous and feminist traditions converge, intersect, and speak with one voice. It is also where probably the strongest pushback from traditional museum institutions come from. The rights to self-representation tends to be a position which Western scientific and academic traditions are most keen to refute and deny. Accountability, or accountability to society, to communities, is a concept largely absent from Western scientific traditions. It is also largely absent from our current museum definition. In this definition, museums seem free-floating institutions, vaguely, in totally unspecified ways, in the service of society, but without society having any defined mechanisms through which to hold the museum accountable. When, after the Women's Museum, with its deep commitment to social issues, I went to work at the old traditional National Museum of Denmark, I viewed with a lot of distrust the neutral or statedly objective purpose of only documenting and interpreting history and the past. I do not believe there is such a thing as a neutral place, and we managed actually in the 1990s to take this old conservative museum into a series of very radical exhibitions and events on issues as immigration, migration, asylum seeking, human rights. However, these types of efforts, and even more so the institutional memory of them, died out really quickly under changed leadership of the museum and the changes in national politics of the 2000s. In these days of raging but also contested neoliberalism, I think it's important for all of us as museum professionals and as museum activists to remember the rich traditions of museum activism and advocacy from the previous century, not just in small or fringe museums as the Women's Museum, but also in national museums, in huge institutions as, for instance, the Smithsonian's active engagement with the civil rights movement. I think we need, not least right now, to remember and to recognize that one cannot place oneself personally or professionally outside societal issues. One is, willingly or not, part of the conflicts of one's era. We tend to use a tone of voice implying that museums, or the cultural sector in general, are a progressive force in society, that museums are, in the American sense of the word, liberal. We focus on the Enlightenment traditions of museums. And in so doing, I think we often tend to underestimate the deep affiliation, the deep ties between museums and the status quo. I am these days very interested in how saying nothing, how not actively protesting or actively resisting is an active defense or becomes an active defense of the status quo or of the most conservative forces in society. These days, when disenfranchised groups have had enough of the ubiquitous absence from history and begin to demand inclusion in, for instance, the naming of streets and buildings, and begin to demand the dismantling of monuments which celebrate and heroize the oppressors, the status quo likes to present itself as if it were neutral, as if it were not in and by itself everyday polarizing. I believe it's important for museum professionals, for historians, for people interpreting the past, to not accept the position that the polarization or politicization originate only with those who are critical of the institutions and of society. Disputing the monuments of history, be it protesting equestrian statues in the urban environment, or be it challenging the ownership to collections from distant cultures and regions, be it demanding repatriation or restitution, this is not a question of wanting to change history, as the cliché and silencing argument runs. It is a question of addressing and attempting right now, in the present time, to right past wrongs and past injustices. In museums, we've had ethics around our objects and around the preservation of our collections, but we've had less definitions about human and social relationships. When I and we started up the new Museum of World Cultures in Sweden in the beginning of the 2000s, we had to define our ethics from outside the cultural sector. We embedded and anchored the museum's mission and purpose firmly in the value system of the UNESCO Declaration of Diversity and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and from these we would then begin to deduct, extrapolate, or translate into what these values and these commitments meant specifically and in detail for each of the strands of our museum activities. We have to remember, as James Baldwin said, we have to remember that whiteness is always a moral choice. It is not a natural category, it's not a given. Enjoying white privilege, and I mean that now in full and broadest meaning of the term, is an active moral choice that we make and confirm every day. I personally went to apprentice at Te Papa Tongareva National Museum of New Zealand, where whiteness is not allowed to run rampant. I went to learn to step carefully, to step back, to stand aside, to unlearn the practices and principles of the European interpretive monopoly. Te Papa is a both tough and gentle learning environment for decolonizing methodologies, as it has so aptly been phrased. Decolonizing one's mind, one's thinking, one's emotional and cognitive setup, I guess one could say, and know that this process of self-confrontation is about examining all one's interrelated blind spots of supremacy, the default position of not just colonialism and imperialism, but also of nationalism, Eurocentrism, of class contempt and class hatred, of heteronormativity. It's a question of working one's way out of the epistemology of ignorance, which allows us personally and professionally to not know, to unknow, for instance, the not just historic but also present human and financial consequences of the slave trade and slavery, to not know or to unknow, for instance, the increasing scale of displacement of people from their homes, hometowns, homelands, and how this is bound to explode in the coming period when not just wars and poverty, but also climate changes begin to really manifest themselves. I returned from Te Papa to Copenhagen, to the Museum of Copenhagen, to be as close to home as possible, where my entanglement and responsibility and accountability would be as clear and transparent as possible, where I am part of every historic and current conflict, and my duty and my right to intervene and interfere are obvious. My efforts and activist methods, I guess one would say, at the Museum of Copenhagen became those of a radical participatory democracy, aligning in many ways our purposes and priorities with the agenda of the municipality on issues of sustainable development and social coexistence. Taking the museum to the street and creating not least digital platforms for people to participate in the collecting, curating, and interpretive processes of the museum, working very close to the everyday lives of local residents. This agreement makes us stronger, contrary as it runs to all axioms of the 20th century, is one of the proud and defiant statements or slogans from this period, displaying an immense faith in democratic processes on all levels, also and maybe particularly outside the traditional representative democracies. These are divisive times, with polarization and division emanating from and encouraged by our political centers, by the core of our parliamentary systems. So it's even more important that in our civil society, if that is a concept we can use, and in our professional context, that we recognize these mechanisms, that we stop supporting the silencing of opposition and protest by also internally in the sector and in our work environment stop discrediting and delegitimizing critical voices. We need to dismantle our ingrained institutional cultures of marginalizing and pathologizing resistance, opposition, protest. This past decade has been rough for museums. In many countries, the cultural sector has experienced severe cutbacks in funding and opportunities. And as a friend of mine, a museum director, said, the 2000s were the decade when we started shutting up for fear of hurting our institutions and losing its funding. In some places right now, the escalating societal conflicts, not least around racism, have led some people to actually speak up rather than to shut up. In the US, radical critique has come from within the core of the American Anthropological Association. Protests are quite vocal on the edges of the American Association of Museums, and ICOM begins to raise a voice in defense of internationalism. With few exceptions, European museums and museum associations seem busy elsewhere. But I think anticipatory obedience is a really dangerous position to take at the moment. For me, fear and anticipatory obedience in the current climate lead only to collusion and complicity, which the sector cannot afford. My strategy, my bit of activism at the moment, is to enter a process of redefining our ethics and our purposes, of re-examining our value base and reaching across to our partners in not least UNESCO to grasp the full meaning of a commitment to concepts of solidarity and empathy, diversity, human rights, of social and natural sustainability, and see where that leads us in a revision and reinvention of the museum definition. And thank you for listening.